This podcast contains adult content and discussions of first-time sexual experiences. Listener discretion is advised. Some stories may include themes that are sensitive or triggering for some audiences. There are some first times we talk about easily, and others we don't quite have the language for. Not because they don't matter, but because they sit somewhere between curiosity, expectation, and vulnerability. Welcome to Sexual Encounters, the very first time. I'm MaryJane, and today's episode is called The Oral Story. Because for many people, the first time giving oral sex isn't always framed as a first time in the same way as having sex for the very first time. And yet it often carries just as much weight. It can be sweet, awkward, confusing, and sometimes all three at once. There's often a script we think we're supposed to follow, something we've seen, heard about, or absorbed somewhere along the way. But when it actually happens, the body, the mind, the moment, they don't always align. So, what does that first time really represent? Is it about pleasure, performance, connection, pressure, or simply trying to understand what's expected of you? Today, we're exploring the emotional and psychological layers of oral sex, what people feel, what they question, and what they carry forward from it. Joining us today is Dr. Jess O'Reilly, a sex and relationship expert, author, and international speaker with a PhD in human sexuality. She's worked with thousands of people to help them build more connected, communicative relationships, and her work reaches millions through media, television, and her podcast, Sex with Dr. Jess. Dr. Jess, welcome. It's so good to have you with us today.
It's my pleasure to be here, and this is such an important topic, so I'm looking forward to diving in.
Dr. Jess, I want to start with something that feels important to name. The first time giving oral sex is often treated as something secondary, almost like a step rather than a significant experience in its own right. And yet, for many people, it can be deeply memorable. How do you understand the psychological weight of this kind of first times, especially when it's not acknowledged as one?
I realize that it's definitely framed in a very heterocentric, in many ways, a male-centric context. And I think what we have to recognize is that first experiences really create these implicit sexual scripts or schemas, even when it's not labeled a first. And we know that the brain kind of encodes novelty and vulnerability very strongly. And this, of course, can be intensified when there's ambiguity, right? Because we're asking ourselves, does this count? This, in turn, it really intensifies meaning because there's no clear script to really anchor the interpretation. And I think there's pressure around that tied to maybe more approval versus pleasure or desire. And then if we think about those who are in bodies or who embody identities that are socialized to prioritize others' pleasure, the moment carries, I think, an added evaluative weight. And when we think about cultural silence around non-penetrative acts, it means we also have fewer shared narratives. And of course, you're breaking this, but when we don't talk about it, it's easy to internalize the experience more privately, which can create more space for shame, for questioning, and for folks who are navigating multiple identities that maybe aren't always at the forefront, that aren't represented. So folks who are queer, racialized, religious, this first can also intersect with identity validation or conflict, which also deepens that psychological impact.
You touched on pressure, And this often comes with a lot of expectation attached to the moment, what it should look like, how it should feel, what it should mean. But the reality is, for many people, it can be uncertain, even disorienting. For instance, for my first time, it wasn't something that I had planned. So there was definitely a sense of pressure to please the other person that I was with at that time. And because I'd never done it before, I was figuring it out in real time. Let's just say I learned very quickly that there's some things you're not supposed to do in that moment. And what is interesting is that I had heard about it, but I had never seen it. I wasn't into porn and things like this. And this was way back before social media. So I had never actually watched the act being done. So part of the experience was trying to understand something that I was expected to know. So where do these expectations come from? And
Ooh.
how and how do they shape how people experience that moment for the first time?
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing. And I recognize that oftentimes these encounters are engagements that we stumble into. We don't go out saying, tonight's going to be the night I'm going to do this specific thing. And in terms of these expectations, I think we have to recognize that more informal channels dominate the meaning and the expectations we attach to sex. So peers, pornography, media, culture, even family. And many of these sources, if not entirely silent around oral sex, tend to emphasize performance, not communication, not pleasure. And, I have to say, certainly we've seen some shifts in popular media. I always think about Shonda Rhimes' repertoire of series that really feature men specifically going down on women more often. But as an aggregate, mainstream media has very limited, myopic, male-centric, performative lens. And so if we couple this with a lack of inclusive sex education and gender, I think about gender norms with giver-receiver roles often mapped and attached to power and desirability, when we think about racialized and cultural stereotypes that shape beliefs about who is supposed to be skilled, who's supposed to be submissive, who's supposed to receive, who's supposed to be dominant, and then general heterosexism that erases queer folks, we end up with these expectations that really shift attention outward to, am I doing this right? Versus inward, how does this feel for me? What am I experiencing? So I think that many of our experiences early on, not just the first time, can be influenced by all of these norms. And if we don't talk about it, the internalization can feel very heavy.
And this segues into the myths that I want us to tackle around oral sex. The first one being, of course, that you're supposed to know what to do, right? There's this unspoken assumption that people should instinctively know what they're doing as if it's something that comes naturally. But it's not for many of us. And it's a process of figuring it out, trial and error. So, what does that expectation have on confidence, comfort, and presence in that moment?
Ooh, all things that sound very nice in comparison, perhaps, to the pressure and this kind of quiet expectation that sexual skill is instinctive. But that creates this sense of imposter feeling in the moment, like you're being evaluated without ever having been taught. And when you're in your head trying to figure it out, as you said, your attention shifts away from your body, from your partner, from the moment, which can be disconnecting. And it can also shut down communication because we worry that if we ask, what do you like, it will expose us as somehow less than or too inexperienced. And when reality, of course, doesn't match some imagined standard, shame can show up very quickly, even though the standard itself was never realistic. And there is no standard because what one person enjoys, 999 others may not. I mean, that's a lot of people, but, I think that access really matters here. If you grew up in a context where sexuality wasn't openly discussed, which most of us come from that background, or where certain identities weren't reflected in education or in media, that gap can feel, I think, even wider. So what we end up seeing is that confidence can be mistaken for competence, and people maybe with more exposure are assumed to just know, while others are made to feel like we're behind.
And then, of course, linked to this is the performance, right? Like you mentioned, people feel like it should be something that they get right rather than something that is pleasurable for both parties, not just the one receiving it, but also the giver, right? So it's kind of like it's this art that you're supposed to master. So how does this performance pressure shape the first experience? And how should people shift towards something that's more mutual and connected, like you said, so that it's mutually agreed on? It's something that you both want to do and it's something that you both enjoy, because not everybody enjoys it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about an act that is framed oftentimes as the norm, as something we all do, and not everybody's into it. And so I think this is such an important conversation to be having so that if you are into it or you're into being into it, we can open up that area for discussion. But also, if you're not into it, that's also okay. And so if we go back to performance, we know that performance really is at odds with pleasure for so many of us. And one of our main motivators for engaging in any sexual activity is pleasure. So if we've got performance as the antithesis to pleasure, where does that leave us? And I know that a lot of people slip into what we call spectatoring. So we start monitoring ourselves from the outside, like a spectator, instead of being in the experience. And this, of course, reduces pleasure and connection. And the focus becomes outcome driven, like we have to do well or get to a certain point. Some of us avoid it altogether because the idea of having to help someone finish in a particular way feels just onerous, right? Maybe we'd like to do a little of it, but not feel like we have to do it for a certain period of time or we have to aim for an orgasm. And again, these expectations are shaped by narrow and unrealistic scripts, especially from porn, right? In the absence of comprehensive sex education that is inclusive and actually acknowledges pleasure, we know that the number one source of self-identified sex education, because porn is not sex education, but we see it as such, porn becomes that de facto education. And that really is like watching a reality show and thinking, oh, okay, this is how I learn about finances, or this is how, I'm watching The Real Housewives. That's how I learn about relationships and friendships. That, of course, is absurd, right? We wouldn't do that. But in the absence of other sources, we do that around sex. And, you know, when we think about how this can create dynamics where one person feels like they're performing and the other is evaluating, it's the opposite of what you're describing to be mutual and grounded. And so if we want to shift from that, we have to kind of let go of these questions around how am I doing and think about replacing them with like, how does this feel? What am I experiencing? What are we experiencing together? And those are reflections, conversations, questions that can be asked before, during, and even after. Maybe not right the moment after, but sexual communication is ongoing, right? It's not as simple as do you like this, do you like that? We want to make space for nuance and all of the feelings. So we can ask those questions. We can refocus on responsiveness, kind of notice cues in our bodies, in our partner's bodies. We can give, receive, welcome feedback, and we can adjust for pleasure rather than trying to execute something perfectly because you're not getting a report card. And there is no set of skills or specific techniques or ways to do it that are universally desired, right? There is no one right way. And we have to make space for the experience to be shaped by the people who are in it, not by an external script. And that's a big overhaul. And oftentimes it can begin by just kind of coming back into the body, into sensation, into breath, into presence. And when we find ourselves wondering, how do I taste? What am I doing? Are they liking it? Am I taking too long? What are they thinking? We might just kind of take a big deep breath and reconnect with one part of our body to be in that moment. Because when we think about our five senses, you can't experience them in the past or the future, right? So if we focus on smell or we focus on what the bed sheet feels like, if it's too much to focus on like kind of the hot spots or tune into a sound. So sometimes it is that mindfulness that brings us back.
Speaking about the mindfulness and being present, especially for the people who may not necessarily like oral sex, but maybe they have a partner who does. Are there some ways that people can explore to kind of help at least try it? You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that we have to consider what it is. So I mentioned before that a lot of folks will avoid it because they feel like they have to do it from start to finish. And I don't want to frame sexuality as finishing with orgasm, but it's that pressure that I'm going to have to perform for a given period of time with a very specific outcome. So the first piece can be communicating, let's try it, just for a moment and see how it feels. There's also a really important piece around trust because it's very vulnerable to have your head down there, to feel like someone might put their hand on your head to guide you, but really it feels like they're compelling you or you don't have a choice in the matter. So I think the conversation and the communication has to really be a prelude to the act, right? Rather than waiting until you're in the heat of the moment, if you can say, this is why I like it, and you can make space to say, this is why I don't, or this is what I'm uncomfortable with. Because if I just say to my partner, I don't like oral sex, of course, it is not a rejection of them, but they may tell themselves the story that it's a rejection of them. So if I can provide more context beyond, I like this, I don't like this, and we get deeper than the what I want, what I don't want, and we get into the why, right? To be able to say, for example, the first time I did it, this happened. And so this is always kind of swirling through my mind. Or in the past, I had an experience that felt triggering. Then our partners can be a part of the process, right? And we can create space for reassurance, for a mutual negotiation to create more safety ultimately, because most of us need to feel safe before we can engage in any of these acts.
Speaking about gently guiding someone's head, there's also, of course, the notion that if you agree to it, it must have been something that you wanted, right? And this speaks to consent. There's a story that happened in 2018 with comedian Aziz Ansari and a woman known as Grace. And I touched on this before in an episode on consent. It's often used as an example of how the same experience can be interpreted very differently, where one person walks away feeling uncomfortable and pressured, while the other assumes everything was wanted because it happened. And sometimes people don't recognize, the verbal and nonverbal cues, as you mentioned. So what might be a playful, suggestive experience for one person may feel like pressure to the other. How can people better understand the difference between going along with something and genuinely wanting it?
Yeah, that's such a important and big question. One of the exercises that I use often in my work involves exploring our sexual values because the more we know about the meaning, the expectations, the background, the desired outcomes that we attach to sex personally, the better we are equipped to navigate some of these more nuanced situations moving forward. So sexual values might involve, talking about your early understandings of sex, where you received messaging around sex, what are the emotional, spiritual, personal, physical, erotic, relational meanings and desired outcomes you attach to sex. So if we can start with this kind of foundational reflection, I think it can be helpful. And I'll plug my podcast. We have an episode on the sexual values in the Sex with Dr. Jess podcast. So folks can go have that conversation or just use this framework that I kind of just walked through to start reflecting on your own values. And then if you can bring that conversation to the table, I think you're laying the groundwork for deeper understanding. But when we get into consent more specifically, we tend to navigate competing motivations. So wanting connection, wanting to avoid conflict, wanting to meet expectations. And that can lead to compliance or acting without full internal alignment. And of course, we have to acknowledge power dynamics here. Things like age, experience, gender norms, cultural expectations can certainly shape how free I might feel to pause or say no. When you bring up the Aziz Ansari case, we certainly have to consider power there. I think nonverbal cues are important, but also they're especially vulnerable to misinterpretation because we tend to read them through our own assumptions rather than checking in. So this ongoing checking in is important. And I get it. People will hear me say that and they'll be like, oh, so I have to say, can I touch you there? Can I use my index finger? No, we're really talking about paying attention to whether you're into it, whether your partner's into it, watching the way their hips move, listening to their breath, asking simple questions like, do you like that? Right? I think for many people, especially folks who have to, on an ongoing basis, navigate marginalization, there can be added pressure to not disrupt the moment or challenge the dynamic. So I think a more grounded way to think about desire is to always remember that we want to consider whether there's a real sense of choice, not just externally, but internally. You know, are your thoughts, are your emotions, are your body, are those things all feeling aligned? Or are you overriding something to keep things going? And really importantly, and I know you've just discussed this on previous podcasts, does it feel safe to change your mind, even mid-experience, without fearing a negative reaction? And sadly, there are many people in long-term relationships who don't have that safety, let alone, you know, a first time or having a new partner that adds intensity and risk to the experience. So healthy consent, we have to remember, is ongoing. It's responsive. It's something you stay in conversation with. It's not something you establish once and assume that it carries through.
And as you said, there are ways to communicate this, right? Because sometimes it's like if I keep checking in, then it feels unsexy. You know, it's no longer organic, right? But you could say it in a sexy way, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the more safety you cultivate and the more presence you're making space for, the more that feels natural. The more you're spectatoring, the more you've got this script running through your mind about whether or not you're good enough, looking for validation, whether or not they're happy with you, the more it feels onerous. But when the sex is good, when the communication is strong, when the safety is a non-negotiable, it becomes much easier and hotter to ask those questions.
Definitely. So, as you said, Dr. Jess, there's a level of vulnerability in oral sex, and we don't always talk about it. It's not just the physical, of course, the emotional, the psychological, even tied to self-worth and validation, as you said. So, what do you see people carrying from the first experience into future intimacy?
So, on one hand, early experiences can really shape how we see ourselves sexually, whether we feel confident or unsure, whether we feel responsible for others' pleasure, or whether we feel disconnected from our own bodies. And of course, if that first experience is centered on pleasing someone else, that pattern can carry forward into future encounters. On the other hand, you know, experiences that include communication and responsiveness can build a sense of agency and trust. But what's interesting, of course, is that meaning isn't fixed. We can reinterpret these early moments later on as we gain more context, more language, more experience, more confidence. So, for those who maybe had a negative first time or a challenging first time or a complex first time, that's not to say that you've laid the groundwork for that to continue forward. I think the capacity to reflect, acknowledge, connect it with how you feel makes space for us to make changes moving forward. I think it's always worth considering how our identities connect to broader questions of desirability, to belonging, to self-worth. And if something did feel off and it wasn't processed at the time, yes, it can show up later in subtle ways. We know it can make us feel tense, it can make us avoid, it can make us feel detached, but certainly with reflection, with supportive conversations, and those conversations don't have to immediately be with your lover, right? It could be listening to this podcast and talking with your friends, and that's what you're doing here is you're opening up safe lanes of conversation. Because we know that with supportive conversations, those same experiences that may not be the ideal blueprint of what we want sex to look like, they can be integrated in a way that supports more clarity, more agency, more connection, and of course, more pleasure moving forward.
Indeed. And of course, the hope is that for listeners, you don't feel guilty about such experiences. You know, you don't feel like it's shameful, but it's just an experience that you take with you and you learn from, etc.
Yeah, that's such an important point because we are hard on ourselves. We worry about being judged by others, but we judge ourselves so intensely. And with sex, because it is so intimate and so personal, but also because there's so much silence and shame around it, anything that isn't a 10 out of 10 can often become internalized. And if we applied that same approach, philosophy, response in any other realm of our lives, we'd be in big trouble, right? Like if I eat all the time, I like to compare food and sex because they're pleasures. And they can be very intimate. And for many of us, it's very tied to identity, to relationships, to family, to culture. Not for everybody, I recognize. But for those of us who love food, of seasoning our food. And with food, if we make a bad meal, we get over it. We make adjustments. If we screw up, we fix it. We don't hang our heads in shame. We don't never approach that dish again. If we don't enjoy a meal, we're not mad about it. We're not tough on ourselves. We're not tough on the person who made it. We keep coming together with, for many of us, all sorts of people in community over this pleasure and this bonding experience. And the same applies to sex. Maybe it's fewer people. It's not that you have to have a huge community, but I do think that the more people we talk to in a safe environment about these topics, the easier it is to navigate them and recognize that no one is having 10 out of 10 sex all the time. Sometimes it's not the best and we get over it, right? Like, and same thing with food. Sometimes you have time for a beautiful meal where everybody brings something, and sometimes you're in a rush and you grab something and you're not, I mean, I'll admit I get disappointed when I waste a meal, but sometimes you just have to grab something on the go because that's the reality of life. And I never regret eating it, almost never, you've got to do it. And it's the same thing with sex to a degree, that you have to make space for the 1 out of 10, the 10 out of 10. And sometimes you have time to really be present and to really reflect. And at other times in our lives, we might have less, but we need to be easy on ourselves. And if we can let go of judgment, then we can start to chip away at shame.
Thank you, Dr. Jess. Let go of judgment so that you can do away with the shame. I like that. So thank you very much, Dr. Jess, for such an intimate and thoughtful conversation on what can be a deeply vulnerable experience for many people. I appreciate you coming on to have this conversation with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me and asking such thoughtful questions and creating space for people to talk about these experiences early on.
Thank you. And speaking of creating space, we have a listener story to share. This one we call Salt Lake City.
Have you ever tasted coarse salt? Yeah, keep that in mind. The first time I gave oral, it was after my first time, right? With the same person. And once, well, I don't know about anybody else, but I had watched porn movies. I had listened to artists, especially hip hop artists, saying Salt Lake City, and I never got it. So one time, while we were kissing and so forth, I don't know, my emotions just led me, like literally, because I was rubbing her genitalia, and I just decided, nah, man, let's just go down, let's just go down. And I just went down, and I went down, and I got to genitalia, and she's like, what are you doing? I'm like, just trust me. I've always wanted to try this. It was like, I went down, and when I tasted it, it was bitterish for the first time. But I could hear her go like, oh. And I tasted, I kissed it. It was bitterish, Second time, it was sort of like salty, and I just went on, and I went on, and I went on, and that's when it clicked. This tastes like cough salt because it was very, very, very strong. And she seemed to have been enjoying it and enjoyed it and enjoyed it. Now, if you've heard songs, songs, that those songs where there's an intro, like the beat is just so intro, and then the beat drops, then it goes on, right? It was like that. She was like, "No, just stick it in already." It was like that was the intro to our sexual intercourse, and she enjoyed it. Like, and a lot of times she just let me be there for a while because she seemed to enjoy it. And one time she went down on me as well. And I won't lie to you, it's an amazing experience because she sucked as well. She sucked me down as well. And one of the experiences as well that I had was she and I would go down on each other as well. The emotions arise. You want to go in. And then it's an intro to that journey, and even midway intercourse would go down, and it improves the whole intercourse as well. At that time, for me, I don't know about anybody else. It was nothing like I expected. At the same time, there were no expectations. I just went along with it. And yeah, man, it was a journey. It was a journey of a lifetime in that time. So yeah, that's about it.
You're listening to Sexual Encounters, the very first time.